But they do not make it as they please. They do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. That was Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written in 1852. In the brains of Americans, perhaps nothing weighs on them more than the mythology of the founding of the Republic. The American Revolution is seen as the beacon of hope, freedom, and democracy. The Constitution, almost a document handed down by God, as were the commandments to Moses. Our guest today challenges much of this narrative, which still penetrates the American national psyche and politics. Joining us today is Gerald Horne. He has published over 30 books. He's the former executive director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, an author, most recently, of The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the USA, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during Slavery and Jim Crow. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you've been exploring this nightmare that hangs over the American psyche for quite some time. But on Reality Asserts Itself, as our viewers know, we usually start with the sort of personal backstory. And then we'll get into some of your work, particularly on your book on the Revolution of 1776. You didn't choose what world you would be born into, nor did any of us. But what world were you born into?
I was born in Jim Crow, St. Louis, Missouri, some decades ago. My parents were from Mississippi. They're both passed away. And I grew up with stories about the horrors of Mississippi, lynching. I recall my mother telling me when I was growing up that when those who were defined as white were coming towards you on the sidewalk, you have to step off the sidewalk and step into the gutter. Certainly you're not supposed to look them into the eye when you're speaking to each other.
What year were you born?
1949. And my parents fled from Mississippi like so many others. Richard Wright, for example, the great novelist, had roots in Mississippi, but wound up in Jim Crow, St. Louis, which admittedly was not the hell on earth that Mississippi was, but was no paradise either.
What kind of neighborhood did you grow up in?
Well, that's an interesting story. The neighborhood I was born into in St. Louis was called Mill Creek Valley. I found it to be a stable, working-class neighborhood near stockyards, but the city fathers thought otherwise, and as often happened in so many cities during that period, the 1950s and 1960s, there was this great project of urban renewal, otherwise known as Negro removal, and we had to abandon that neighborhood for another neighborhood in North St. Louis, where actually now my sister lives in that house, which when we moved into it, it was a mostly white neighborhood, but shortly thereafter, magically, it turned into a mostly black neighborhood.
This is part of block busting.
Well, yeah, block busting, urban renewal, Negro removal. It's interesting. I'm doing a book now on the black press. Claude Burnett, he was the founder of the Associated Negro Press, and he made some of his early fortune, he's black, through block busting. That is to say, after these black Americans started moving into this previously all-white neighborhood, the whites started panicking and began selling their property for a song. He would buy them up and then sell them for a higher price.
We did this story in Baltimore. A journalist named Antero Piatella did a three-part interview with him. He wrote a book that this was entirely deliberate. Like the real estate speculators were this is a planned thing to try to scare the hell out of whites. They would actually sometimes, in Baltimore at least, they'd even buy the houses for black families and then create the rumor that the prices are all going to drop, you have to sell, and of course, we'll, as a favor to you, we'll buy it from you.
Right, right.
What did your parents do?
My father was a truck driver. He was a member of the Teamsters Union, which used to bill itself, maybe still does, as the largest union in the capitalist world. It has over 2 million members. He drove a truck for construction sites, and he was also a cab driver. My mother was a domestic, like so many black women of that era.
And what was the politics in the house? The Teamster politics could be anything, actually. It's kind of...
Well, that requires a multiple answer. I grew up with stories about the Teamsters being influenced by organized crime and looting the pension funds of the workers, including the pension fund of my father, by the way, which left him in terrible straits. But I also grew up in a neighborhood in city St. Louis where the Teamsters were led by a guy by the name of Harold Gibbons, who was actually unique amongst Teamsters leaders because he was a social democrat, believe it or not, in the 1950s and 1960s in Jim Crow, Red Scare St. Louis. Took anti-war positions, took progressive positions on Jim Crow, which is partly how my father came to be a member of that union. So it was a contradictory situation in which I found myself.
Because at the leadership level, the Teamsters had no problem supporting not only war, but Republicans or just about anything else that seemed to be in their immediate interest.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, often quite a militant union when it came to actually wages and working conditions.
They were not afraid to go on strike. And at the end of the day, it's proper to say that the strike is the most potent weapon that a union has to wield. And if a union wields that weapon, that can compensate for a lot of deficiencies.
And the Teamsters had defended their picket lines.
Absolutely. They were well known for being able to use their fists and being able to use baseball bats and bicycle chains. It was a militant union. There's no question about it.
And how much of that did you grow up in? How active was your father in the union?
My father was not very active in the union, but I used to read all the publications which would get mailed to our house. That's how I know a lot about this history. Although I have to confess that what I mostly remember about the Teamster publications is they used to publish jokes. And I remember a lot of the jokes. I don't remember too many of the stories.
I've always been kind of intrigued, or trying to understand, I guess is the better way to say it, that when a young black man or woman grows up in America and the culture, the media, the schools are filled with this Americanism.
Yes.
Yet your parents are telling you stories about Mississippi. Your own experience is an apartheid racist experience. How does that jive with this feeling that I'm also an American?
Well, you know, Dubois, W.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, a founder of Pan-Africanism, talked about double consciousness, this contradictory aspect, the two warring ideals in one body, I think was the phrase that he used, which basically encapsulates what you just suggested. With regard to myself, I think that I always took the stories of the so-called American dream with a grain of salt, or a shaker of salt, because it did not correspond with what I knew and what my parents had told me. I think, unfortunately and sadly, for a lot of black Americans growing up, it can lead to a certain kind of cynicism and a certain kind of despair because they're being bombarded with all this propaganda that points in one direction, the reality points in another direction. It can be quite confusing and quite destabilizing.
Now you're born in '49. It's just after World War II. Mm-hmm. What was I mean, I grew up, I'm born just a little bit after you are, and I know we grew up with all kinds of stories of World War II. I mean, television was one World War II show after another. And where was your father during the war, and what sense of that did you get growing up?
Well, this is where some of my historical research probably is going to infect my memories. My father didn't fight during World War II, not because he was a pacifist or an anti-war activist. It was because of his age. He was born, he thinks, because he really didn't know, because oftentimes birth records weren't kept for black Americans in Mississippi. He thinks he was born in 1898, which would mean that in 1941, when the United States entered the war, he was a bit above the age they were looking for. But since I've done all this historical research, I now know that, interestingly enough, St. Louis, black St. Louis, was a hotbed of pro-Tokyo sentiment. That is to say that Japan had made an appeal to black Americans, as many real or imagined antagonists of the United States has done over the centuries.
I'm going to interrupt you here.
Sure.
We're going to really dig into this. And this is actually a pretty good teaser, so you're going to have to come back for the other parts.
Sure.
Because we're going to dig into this whole thing of Japan positioning itself as the leader of the fight against white supremacy.
Right.
But right now I want to stay on your story.
Sure.
So
I won't go into, okay, it affects my memory.
We'll get there, but we need to get where you were then. And like I know for myself, and I think probably for most, I would say, white North Americans, of our generation, you know, I'm born in 51, so around this period. This was a big deal, World War II narrative. You know, we fought for freedom and democracy and all the rest, and against Hitler. And we used to have, as kids, we used to have these songs, you know, against, you know, ridiculing Mussolini and Hitler and things. But I had a conversation with Danny Glover, who we both know, and he was telling me when he grew up, World War II was practically off the radar. It wasn't, unless you had a family member who was actually fighting, it was kind of not part of your narrative. It was out there somewhere. What was it for you?
Well, I agree. Probably I have more memories of the war in Korea, 1950 to 1953, since I was born after World War II. And I recall an uncle who claimed he wore a ring that he said he had cut from the finger of a Chinese soldier on the Korean Peninsula. I don't know if that was true or not. My mother was a big supporter of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I think that affected my memories, or has affected my memories. In fact, my oldest sister was named Mary Eleanor Horne. Eleanor after Eleanor Roosevelt, Mary after, of course, Christian Mary. And I think that suggests the kind of household on which I came into being.
Now, your father was a member of the Union. He wasn't that active.
No.
You growing up in St. Louis, the overall arc of the American narrative, I assume, was very strong. It's a pretty racist city, as was Baltimore. When do you start to kind of question all of this at a more profound level?
Probably when we were forced to move from Mill Creek Valley to North St. Louis, because it didn't, even at that age, it didn't make sense to me. And then moving to North St. Louis, entering a previously all-white school, because I'd gone to all-black schools up until the age of 10 or 11. And then at that age, entering all-white schools and then being subjected to sort of normal, everyday Jim Crow by people who basically didn't know any better. So I think that begins to shape
What's
my
an example of that?
Well, you know, the black scare. That is to say, people getting nervous when you're around. You know, clutching their handbags, or you may know the story of Reggie Jackson, the former baseball player. When he goes to the New York Yankees in the 1970s, he lives in an apartment building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He gets on an elevator with his dog, and he tells the dog to sit, and all the white people in the elevator sit down on the floor of the elevator. So, you know, it's sort of the black scare, people sort of intimidated by your presence, nervous about your presence, and then, of course, they might just decide to do a preemptive strike against your presence.
And did they?
Yeah, we got into fights, fracases of various sorts on a racialized basis.
Go back to this idea of Americanism, and at some point, I know, because I know your story, you come to a far more radical analysis of just whose America is this. Talk us through the arc of getting there.
Well, as you know, during the 1960s, the United States was under a lot of pressure with regard to its Jim Crow practices, because it professed to be this paragon of human rights virtue in the battle with the former Soviet Union, and so there was pressure to desegregate. And it was under those conditions that I got admitted to Princeton University, an Ivy League school. And I think when you go to an Ivy League school in the 1960s, being black, I think it can either cause you to want to join the U.S. ruling elite or to rebel against the U.S. ruling elite. And I fell into the second category.
Why?
I'm not really sure. I mean, when you say why, I'm trying to contrast myself with my classmates who fell into that other category. And I'm not really sure why they fell into that category and I fell into the category that I did. I'm not sure.
You kind of, Bob Moses had sort of the same kind of opportunities to go to elite schools and kind of made somewhat similar choice to join the civil rights movement and become an activist. But what is it that tips that? Because obviously the path was clear for you. You could have made a success.
I don't know. Probably because I was interested a lot in writing and studying history. And as they say in the business world, that's not easy to monetize. And so that probably predetermined my path, because, as you know, there are lots of starving writers in the United States of America. It doesn't provide that many options.
Who inspired you in those days?
You mean historical figures or day-to-day figures?
Whatever. I mean, is that part of the kind of choices you made?
Sure. I would say, in terms of historical figures, the people you might suspect. Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, figures of that sort. That is to say, Black Americans who were intellectuals, who were political activists, who were trying to make a difference, who were trying to radically transform not only this society but the world. So those were the kinds of people I aspired to be like, who I looked up to, and actually who I've been writing about.
You come of age, not, kind of you grow up in and become of age during the Cold War, height of the Cold War, but particularly McCarthyism, House of Un-American Activities, communism, socialism, even radicalism is almost akin to being a traitor. How much effect did the Cold War have on you?
Well, as you probably know, in the Black American community, it's a bit different. I mean, certainly that community is affected by the Cold War, but then, as now, the general consensus in the Black American community was not so much if you were hard on communism, but whether you were hard on white supremacy. That's what they were concerned about. And if you were hard on white supremacy, then you get a lot of leeway. You got a lot of respect. And I think obviously that helps to shape people's consciousness. Now, how people decide how hard they're going to be on white supremacy and what path that's going to take is a separate question.
You got very involved in the movement against apartheid in South Africa.
At Princeton, most of those student movements in the late 1960s when I was an undergraduate, a lot of them focused on anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, focused on bringing Black studies departments into universities. For some reason, and I'll have to think about why, we got involved in pressuring the university to divest itself from investments in corporations that had holdings in South Africa. In retrospect, that probably had something to do with the fact that we had a number of students from the African continent who matriculated alongside us. And that was probably the influence that pushed us in that direction. We wound up taking over buildings with regard to that project. And we did quite a bit. And that put me on a track in the anti-apartheid movement. I was active in that movement. Actually, I guess you could say I'm still active in that movement because now I write a lot about Southern Africa. But at the time, as an undergraduate, I was an activist. And when I was living in New York in the 70s and in the 80s, I was an activist around the anti-apartheid movement, organizing concerts, raising money for the ANC, African National Congress of South Africa, SWAPO of Namibia, MPLA in Angola, organizing picket lines, demonstrations, all sorts of things.
You've written, just to go back to a comment you made a little earlier about the Cold War wasn't such a big thing in Black America, the anti-communism. But you've also written that the civil rights movement, many of the leaders made a kind of a deal to receive some compromises in exchange for being quite rigorously anti-communist. And there are a lot of blacks involved in the communist movement, and you've written about that. So it wasn't a non-issue.
No, it wasn't a non-issue. I was just speaking on the micro level in terms of being an individual in St. Louis, for example, in a particular neighborhood.
Ordinary public opinion.
Exactly. But yes, I mean, if you look at the figure of W.E.B. Du Bois, he's sacked from the NAACP in 1948 precisely on Cold War grounds. He continues moving to the left, the NAACP continues moving to the right and to the center. That was a turning point in the history of Black America and the history of the United States as a whole, because interestingly enough, despite what some people may think, the NAACP, which is headquartered, as you know, right here in Baltimore, was not as active as it could have been or should have been on the question of the war against Vietnam, for example. Now, I've written quite recently that that was a fundamental and profound mistake because I don't think the leaders recognized that so much of our progress, that is to say Black Americans' progress, was dependent upon international public opinion. And international public opinion was quite hostile to the U.S. role in Vietnam. So by putting all their eggs in Washington's basket, in some ways they made a fundamental strategic mistake, which we're still paying for.
And this is when King makes his speech against Vietnam. He talks about, I can't remember if he uses the phrase conspiracy of silence, I think. But essentially that's what he's talking about.
Well, yes. Riverside Church, I think it's April 1967. a scant year before he's assassinated in Memphis in April 1968. He makes that famous speech. And even before then, he was crusading in his own way against the war in Vietnam. But as you know, there's always been this idea of the Faustian Bargain that the Black American leaders have to make. That is to say, in return for not being subjected to being bludgeoned into submission, they make concessions in order to survive. And as NAACP leaders will tell you, a number of organizations have fallen by the wayside. The NAACP is still standing. So that would be their response if one of their leaders were sitting here.
What would your response be?
Well, I think the price was too steep. Everything comes with a price. And I think that the problem was that the concessions that they made, the compromises that they made, did not put us in a situation from which we could advance. Because there are compromises that lead you and leave you with the ability to fight another day so that you can advance. And then there are compromises that leave you in a weakened condition. And I think the compromises they made were in the latter category, not least because we, that is to say Black Americans and others, won the right to sit at a lunch counter, but did not win the right to have enough in our paycheck to pay the bill, because part of what was going on during the movement against Jim Crow was the crushing of trade unions. Most Black Americans are from working class backgrounds, like my parents, for example. And when trade unions were weakened and crushed, that meant that what we might have gained on the so-called race front, we lost on the class front. And as you weigh the equities and liabilities, I think in many ways, we came out worse, which is why you hear so much nostalgia, interestingly enough, particularly amongst young people, for the Jim Crow era. Of course, they didn't live through the Jim Crow era like I did, and so therefore their memories of it might be a little hazy. But I think what they're expressing is unease with those compromises, and unease with where those compromises left us. And I think they're also expressing unease with the institutions that had to go under as a result of those compromises.
Okay, we're going to continue this discussion in the next part of our series of interviews with Gerald Horne on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.
I came to Baltimore in 1967. So I'd only been in Baltimore for about a year at the time of the rebellions here. It's strange thinking back on it now. There were mixed emotions. After watching so long the struggles of Black people resisting, because I'm one of those folks that came of age during the Civil Rights Movement, watching most of it on television. Seeing King, the peaceful warrior, get killed, get shot down, there was almost a sense of closure that something else was going to come after this, and there would be a reckoning for his death. So there was some fear in there, some concern, and at the same time an anticipation of participation was there for me. But Martin Luther King had given his life, and it had been taken by, we saw at the time, by white America, and its inability to change. That had to be opposed in my mind. And these were random thoughts. I didn't know how to do it, how it was going to happen, but probably at that point, I began looking for a way for it to happen. The books that we've published over the last 40 years are directly connected to Martin's life, Martin's death, and perhaps more so, they're connected to what he is connected to. That whole stream of ancestral consciousness that was here before he came and continues now today. So the books that I publish and have enjoyed publishing are books that hold the spirit of that consciousness up. Those books continue to share or make sure that consciousness is going to be available to be shared by people. The spirit of Martin Luther King, the spirit of Dubois, the spirit even of Booker T, and all of those ancestors that struggled in the way they struggled are what's captured in the books that Black Classic Press prints.
We're not just doing the news because we want to understand. We're doing it because we want to make a difference. We want to make real change.
If you ran Maryland and Baltimore in the interests of the majority of its people, what policies would you create?
Little white children in their neighborhoods, they got skateboard rings, playgrounds. Our children got the concrete jungle.
We are so just let down by the hypocrisy in the politics.
Our plan is to develop news, analysis, and cultural programming that will break through to a Baltimore audience.
We produce a roundtable show called The Real Baltimore to delve into issues like housing, education, poverty, and policing.
We're covering everything from toxic waste dumps in Baltimore to global rising temperatures.
Does treating prisoners like animals actually make our community safer? That's what we're trying to find out in Rally in the bars.
The whole Bush Show is an artist interview show where we sit down with performing artists. I'm your host, Easy Jackson.
We will deepen our investigative work and debate solutions in town halls held in our downtown studios.
We know that this is an ambitious plan, but the times cry out for it. So please help us make real news.
Okay, first let me welcome everybody. I'm glad y'all came out. I joined the Real News in 2014 when I got out of prison after spending 44 years as a political prisoner for the Black Panther Party. I came back to the community with an interest of doing something for the community. And I started working down in Gilmore Homes. I still work down in Gilmore Homes, but when I came across the Real News, I realized that that was the key to making changes in the community. Now, the Real News tries to tell your story from the ground in a journalistic way, evenly applied to truth, insight, and analyzation. We don't take government funding. We rarely get grants. We're not held hostage by advertisers. We can only do this in programs like this. And of course, you've seen some of the things that we do. We can only do this with your support. And we can only do this with membership. We're here in Baltimore because Baltimore is a city that represents what's happening in almost every other city across the country. We're close enough to DC, we're further enough away from New York, Wall Street, to have some kind of impact. So one of the things I'm gonna ask is that if you all will join us, become members. And if you don't feel like becoming members, sign up and get our emails. And if you can, support us by making a donation. If you make a donation tonight, there's a rouge out there at the table. Or if you make a $20 donation, you'll get a Real News mug. If you want to make more, you want to be a sustainer, you can do that. We appreciate that. It makes a difference. And that's what we're here for. We want to make a difference. One of the things I'm tasked with is introducing two great men. And it's not an easy task. And I'm going to start off by trying to give you a little insight on the last person, Paul Coates. Paul Coates is a friend of mine. Paul Coates and I were in the Black Panther Party together, and when I got locked up, Paul Coates traveled all around the country organizing, but he came back here. And he came back here, and he started working with me so that I wouldn't be alone. I had family, I had friends, but people come and go. He spent the next 44 years, that 44 years I spent in prison, outside, looking out for me, giving me support, organizing for me, and helping me organize in the prison system. While he was doing that, he found the time to go to college. He found the time to get his master's degree. He found the time to get his doctor's degree. And in fact, it was his effort to get that education that eventually encouraged me. Because when I went into prison, I was mad, really mad. You know, I just needed to get out. I needed to be treated like a human being. And I didn't want to hear anything that America had to say at that point. And I realized that it was important. After watching him, he came back with his master's degree. He started a bookstore to support us. Then he eventually opened the Black Classic Press that continues to support prisoners all across the country. So I went to school, and I got a couple of degrees, but he's always been, even though he's been my partner and my comrade, he's always been like my big brother, even though I'm actually his big brother. But one final thing to show you the character of the man is, while I was in prison, and of course I got locked up, I was in the post office, I lost my income, etc. He brought a house, and he kept that house for me. And I kept telling him, rent it out, sell it, whatever. It was going to drain you. He didn't let it go. He kept that house, and he saved it. And when I came out, it was there for me. So I had a place to live. So I can't tell you all the things he's done, but that should tell you what kind of character he has. So I want you to join me in welcoming Paul Coates. I know. Now, even a harder job, and I've just met him through my work at the Real News, and I've watched him, and I've been to his lectures in the city, and I've came in contact with him in other places, is Dr. Gerald Horne. This man, I really can't tell you all about him, but he holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore Chair of African American Studies at Houston University. But he's an author, and he's wrote dozens and dozens of books. And I stopped counting. I asked him how many, and he's not even sure anymore. I stopped counting at about 35. He's been in hundreds of lectures and interviews. He graduated, well, he got his bachelor's degree from Princeton, and he graduated with his PhD from Columbia. And he went back to the University of California, Berkeley, and got another degree. He writes on a wide range of things. He writes about Dubois. He writes about fascism, imperialism. He writes about slavery in Brazil. His present work is, and it's here so you can get it, it's the apocalypse of the settlers' colonialism. I hope I got that title right. Okay, but he also wrote, and I just selected another book, and I know it's current. It just came out. It's The Rising Sun. It's the relationship of Afro-Asians under the rise of the Japanese. So there's 1,000 things. You've seen the promo, so you know all the stuff he's been involved in. The union organizing, the student organizing. He's not only in the ivory tower, but he's down on the ground organizing in the street. You know, so please, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerald Horne.
Yes, sir. All right. How's everybody doing? And is this mic good? Good, 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 good. So look, this is going to be a great night, okay? It's going to be a great night for me, okay? I'm going to leave here so full of Gerald Horne and so full of the information Gerald Horne has. I came here for this. I've been looking forward to it. Anybody see the stuff on Facebook? Well, look, I was not lying. I have been anticipating this. And so we're going to have a conversation, and it's going to range. And it's going to range because Gerald has that kind of depth. He has that kind of worldview that we can have a conversation and talk about climate and its impact on Africans and African slavery in the 1500s, the 1600s, and then he can come back forward in the next breath and talk about Donald Trump. So that's the way this is going to go. So if it looks like I am like focused on Gerald and not focused on y'all, forgive me. I'm serious. I'm serious. Like you know how the parents and you say, well, I got mine, you got to get yours. It's going to be one of them things. Like I'm here to get it. Now I'm going to ask questions and then I'm going to try and get out of the way. I'm going to try to get out of Gerald's way while he answers and while he responds and while he goes wherever he wants to go with it. That's what I'm going to try to do. Okay. We're going to talk for a while, and I hope we can bring up enough of the conversation that gives you guys an opportunity to ask some questions to open it up even further, okay? I did bring some questions with me from Facebook folks sent in, and I'm going to reach down and get them. But can we kick this off, Gerald? First of all, welcome to Baltimore and welcome to our community, which recognizes and loves and honors, Gerald, your contribution as an activist and even more so, your contribution as a scholar. Eddie talked about Gerald's books. And if this seems like love praise, like I'm giving this cat, like I'm buttering him up and stuff like that, trust, I am doing that, but it's all good because it's all true. And it's like how I feel, okay? And I don't mind saying that and acknowledging you publicly for the work you've done because I follow our scholars. I follow the people who have laid out our history, and those are the people who I honor the most. And so to have you in front of me as one of the greatest, given the work that you've done, is tremendous. So the thing I want to start with is the title on this conversation was Why Black Lives, I believe, Don't Matter. Okay, trust me, y'all, I didn't come to talk about that, okay? But we're going to get that out of the way because that was one of the questions that came across on the internet. You've done lectures focused in that vein. Can we talk about that for a minute? Why did you phrase your position that way?
Well, first of all, thank you for that much too generous introduction. It's good to be back in Baltimore at the Real News. I hope you people in Baltimore realize what a jewel you have here, and just in terms of the simple building, not to mention what goes on inside this building. But with regard to why Black Lives Don't Matter, let me say that on YouTube, there's about an hour lecture I gave at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in February 2018, laying out this entire narrative, which I'll telescope right now. And the reason why I gave that lecture and the reason why I'm mentioning it now is that I think that there's been a fundamental misreading of the history of the United States of America. That is to say that contrary to many, I'm afraid to say, that I do not see the founding of the United States in 1776 as a great leap forward for humanity. I do see it as a great leap forward for many slave owners in particular, and many real estate speculators in particular. But with regard to the indigenous population who were residing on this soil hundreds of years ago, obviously it was not a great leap forward for them, many of whom have been extinguished. And I talk about them in my book, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. You'll find the names of Maryland ethnic groups who were wiped out with the advent of settler colonialism on this soil. And certainly with regard to the enslaved population, it was not a great leap forward because, number one, with the triumph of the settlers in 1776, you had an expansion of slavery, you had a worsening of slavery, you had the slave traders in the United States oust the Spanish from control of the slave trade to Cuba as early as the 1790s, a few years after the United States is founded. You had the slave traders from the United States ousting the Portuguese and the Spanish and others from the richest and most ample market, that is to say the slave trade to Brazil. They had controlled that market by the 1830s and the 1840s. And not only that, but you may recall that in 1836, Texas seceded from Mexico on the same grounds or similar grounds in which the so-called Confederate States of America seceded from the United States in 1861. That is to say, because Mexico had moved to abolition of slavery in the 1820s, and Texas, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston et al. Were not down with that, so they seceded. And so a number of the enslaved population in Cuba were there at the behest of these slave traders in independent Texas. So my point is that Black lives don't matter because Black people were not seen as being part of the human family. We were seen as being apart from the human family, only worthy of being hewers of wood and drawers of water, only worthy of being enslaved, and therefore our lives were not taken seriously historically, and that has extended to this very day. Now, there are those who suggest that the advent of certain liberties and so-called freedoms helped to justify enslavement and mass dispossession, but it seems to me if you can rationalize enslavement or mass dispossession, you can rationalize anything. You can rationalize Donald Trump being president. And in any case, those rights did not apply to many of us, as evidenced by the fact that even today, they still don't apply to many of us. That is to say, you still have Black people being slain in the streets by officers of the state without due process of law, with officers of the state sometimes not even receiving a slap on the wrist. Sometimes they receive a pat on the back. And we had thought that with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we at least had access to public accommodations, but the recent incident in Philadelphia at Starbucks suggests that we're now even being challenged with regard to going place to get coffee even. So I would say that slavery and the, quote, stain, unquote, of slavery that was placed upon black people as a result of that peculiar institution, as is euphemistically been called, is one reason why black lives don't matter. But perhaps even a more important reason is this, that sadly enough, historians have not addressed sufficiently. And that is to say that in 1865, slavery was abolished as a result of a grand civil war in which tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people perished. But unlike in the British colonies, Jamaica, Barbados, etc., where the slave owners were compensated, or unlike those who had enslaved those we now call Haitians, where eventually the slave owners were compensated by independent Haiti, which obviously helped to put independent Haiti in a hole from which it's been difficult to extricate itself from. In the United States, of course, the slave owners were expropriated without compensation. And oftentimes when I tell this to my students as they're fiddling with their smartphones, I go and grab the smartphone from their hand and say, I've just expropriated your property without compensation. I take it you're not very pleased with that. You probably want to take me outside this classroom and thrash me as a direct result from taking this valuable property. Well, that's how the slave owners felt post-1865. Their property was taken without a compensation, but not only that, then the property was walking around being very cheeky about the entire matter, saying, you know, we didn't even like you anyway. And so this helps to generate a kind of fury and wrath that is yet to be extinguished, not least because it's hardly ever discussed or talked about. And so that also helps to devalue black lives, the fact that when some see us, they see lost fortunes, perhaps in the deepest recesses of their consciousness. And because of this, and because the whole phenomenon of white supremacy has not been sufficiently investigated and interrogated by many of our scholars, I think that's one of the many reasons why black lives don't matter. And I should mention, before I leave you drowning in the sea of pessimism, that one of the ways we've been able to extricate ourselves from this dilemma is through international solidarity. That is to say, I mentioned the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which helped to ignite a general crisis in the entire slave system that could only be resolved with that system's collapse. With the Haitian Revolution, Britain was forced to move towards abolition of the slave trade. 1807 then forced the United States in a similar direction because Britain was fearful of losing its cash cow that was Jamaica, not to mention Barbados and the other Caribbean islands. And then there's a de facto alliance, as I talk about in my book on the Haitian Revolution, between London and the Haitian revolutionaries to put pressure on the United States and independent Texas, which creates conditions that lead to a U.S. Civil War, leading to the abolition of slavery. And then in the 20th century, with the advent of the socialist project, you see a transition from race being a major axis of many societies in the capitalist world to class being a major axis and the organizing of trade unions. And of course, during the Cold War, which I talked about in that video that many of you just saw, there was tremendous pressure on the United States, with Ghana coming to independence in 1957, the United States fearing that it would lose hearts and minds in an independent Africa and independent Caribbean as long as black people in the United States were treated so atrociously. That creates a dynamic whereby, say, the United States begins to extend scholarships to Kenyan students like Barack Obama Sr., who arrives in the United States in the late 1950s, and unless you accept Donald J. Trump, then helps to father a child, Barack Obama Jr., or the second, who then goes on to become president. So there have been international factors and international solidarity that has led us to be able to fight back against this cruelty to which we've been subjected. And that's one of the problems that we face today, because as noted, one of our leading organizations, the NAACP, headquartered right here in Baltimore, made this Faustian bargain where in return for turning their back on our internationalists, their founder, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson et al., they would accept the civil rights concessions, but as any lawyer can tell you, when the conditions for a bargain or contract evaporate, well, generally speaking, oftentimes that bargain or contract evaporates. And certainly with the erosion, if not collapse, of the Cold War and the fact that our organizations don't engage in the kind of international outreach that they once did, we're subjected to even more horrors today, perhaps than any time in modern history. Sorry for that long-winded exposition.
No, it's good. It's good. So sometimes it'll go like that, and other times I'm going to jump in there because sometimes, like, what Gerald does is, like, he covers so many subjects. You want to say, wait, one minute, man. Let's go over that one more time. So, but in this case, that was a wonderful examination of why Black lives don't matter. Let me ask you this, though. You have a general, like, part of what you laid out there is a general theme or thesis that's running through your work very strong right now. And it's probably captured and reflected in one of the books that's on sale outside now, and that's Counter-Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Counter-Revolution, and I don't know how many books are out there, and I'm going to make a disclosure too. We just published one of Gerald's books. Okay, we just
Black
published
Classic
one
Press.
as Black Classic Press. So I'm not going to do the Sean Hannity thing. Okay, I'm not going to be like Sean Hannity and talk to Gerald, and then I know I got a book out there for y'all about. But look, I'll talk some about our books. I'm going to bring Gerald up to that. But I wanted to say this about Counter-Revolution. I don't know how many books are out there, but whatever books are out there, y'all should buy it. Because there's I think there it's laid out centrally, the theme that you keep going back to and the theme that we need to examine more and more and more. And that theme, which you can share with us better than I can, but that theme generally holds that what we know is that great event, that great birthing of this country, was not, had less to do with the Boston Tea Party, had less to do with the settler colonists here being upset that they were taxed without representation, and had much, much more to do with the sphere that their great commodity, the African body, was going to be liberated. Can you expand on that? And yeah, can you expand on that? I got another one that goes right with that. But can you talk about that and what drove you to a conclusion of a counter-revolution?
Well, part of it deals with Southern Africa. I lived in Zimbabwe, wrote a book about Zimbabwe. You may know that Zimbabwe was formerly Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. In November 1965, Ian Smith and a minority regime, mostly of British nationals, attempted to secede from London, not least because they felt London was moving towards African majority rule. And at the time, and as I say in the book, Ian Smith and the racists said that they were only walking in the footsteps of 1776. And then, of course, having lived through other settler revolts, such as the revolt in Algeria in the 1950s, culminating, of course, unsuccessfully with Algerian independence circa 1962, I came to have a very sour disposition about settler revolts. And then I mentioned Texas, where I now live, where, as noted, in 1836, there was another settler revolt in order to evade the abolition of slavery. And so I came to the secession of 1776 with that in mind. And from my telling of the story, as reflected in that book, I point to two factors, or at least two factors, minimally two factors, that you should examine when trying to understand the founding of the United States. One is Somerset's case, which of course is reflected in the movie Belle. How many of you seen the movie Belle with Gugu Mbatha Roy and directed by Ama Asante, the Ghanaian British director, which I would recommend. Somerset's case, to refresh your recollection, is this case from 1772 where London moves to abolish slavery in England, and there's a fear that that decision would leapfrog the Atlantic, jeopardizing the fortunes of slave owners. It's not a coincidence, as the historians like to say, that the spearhead of the revolt are slave owners, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, or lawyers for slave owners, like John Adams, for example. And that is a driving force for this revolt. And then secondly is the so-called Royal Proclamation of 1763, whereby London is reluctant to continue expending blood and treasure, moving west, taking the land of the Native Americans so that real estate speculators like George Washington can profit handsomely. And this too is driving the animosity amongst the settler class, causing them to revolt. That's the short answer to that very important question that you asked. But then I should also mention this book I just published in the last 6 weeks, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, which deals with the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism in 17th century North America and the Caribbean. The apocalypse, from my telling of the story, is represented by another so-called revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, where from not only my telling of the story, and I should also mention that especially with regard to 1688, other historians have made this point as well, that when the merchants seek to clip the wings of the monarch, setting the monarch on a path to the figurehead status of Queen Elizabeth in London today, one of the driving factors was the fact that the Royal African Company had been set up in 1672 under the thumb of the monarch, and the merchants wanted in on the action, and under the guise of freedom and liberty, they lead a revolt that then leads to the clipping of the wings of the monarch and the rise of the merchant class. And then, as in that book,
what was the action, Gerald?
Well,
wanted in on the action. What was the action?
the slave trade.
Okay.
And I should also say, I mean, I'm telescoping a lot. I mean, because the thesis of that book is very simple, that in the early 1600s, England was a minor power on the fringes of Europe. By the late 1600s, England was a superpower, well on its way to being the dominant power on planet Earth, and then it hands off the baton to what I call its revolting spawn, now known as the United States of America, which then carries that tradition on into the 21st century, although, of course, if you're paying attention to the news, you might have noticed that there might be another power in the passing lane as we speak, and we can talk about that because I have some things to say about that. But in any case, from my telling the story, what helps explain that transition from minor power to major power is slavery and the slave trade. The fact that in 1655, London had taken Jamaica from the Spanish, opening up more territory for poor settlers who could then come to Jamaica to become involved in the sugar boom, which pours more wealth into the coffers of London, which allows it to build a bigger navy. And then by 1672, it allows it to oust the Dutch from Manhattan and a good deal of the middle Atlantic, what are now the middle Atlantic states. And then, of course, with 1672, with the Royal African Company, develop more interest in the slave trade. But of course, the problem for the slave traders is that people didn't want to be enslaved, and so they were rebelling constantly and ferociously. And then, of course, that leads to my 1776 book.
So on the one hand, it is the pressure, if I have this correct, on the one hand, it's the pressure from the merchant class. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it is, and all of this is shaping. On the other hand, you do a long narrative in most of your work, but especially in counter-revolution, I'm thinking, about African resistance.
Yes, absolutely.
The cost of holding people enslaved drove England crazy.
That's right.
I don't know, you know, sometimes when I was reading that book, I was just fascinated because I read, okay? But you had more rebellions, not in the United States. This is throughout the Caribbean and throughout the rest of the world that was actually having an impact on the consciousness of the British, that was not having that same consciousness on the Americans. So can you talk about some of the, one of the things you talked about was the Africans who had taken the ship. And the European was escaping from Africa, and he saw these Africans on the ship headed back to the continent. That was fascinating, and I've never read that. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of African resistance?
Well, of course, there are shipboard insurrections. That is to say, after people are placed on the ship, they revolt, and sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. And then in the North American mainland, there are a number of very pivotal and crucial revolts. New York City, 1712, New York City again, 1741, South Carolina and Stonewall's Revolt, 1739. And once again, London was being forced to expend blood and treasure on behalf of these settlers who kept bringing over more Africans because they were mesmerized by the possibility of generating more wealth, but were not able to deal with what might be called the downside of that, which is that you bring over so many Africans, you create gross numbers that make for fertile conditions for slave trades, for slave revolts, excuse me. So this is a driving force. And of course, the epical event in terms of slave revolts is the Haitian Revolution, where the worst nightmare of the slave owners take place, 1791 to 1804, which then in turn helps to inspire revolts in Virginia, with Gabriel's Revolt circa 1800, and inspire revolts in Barbados circa 1816, inspire revolts in Jamaica, et cetera. And I should also, if I may, as they say in the United States, pivot to talk about another chapter in slavery that does not get sufficient attention. And I'm speaking of the fact that after the U.S. slavery is abolished, circa 1865, many of the U.S. slave traders they take the Keith Sweat approach, make it last forever. You know, they want slavery to go on, and so they decamp to the South Seas and start enslaving Melanesians and Polynesians, and taking them to be bonded laborers in Fiji and Queensland, Australia. The Kingdom of Hawaii, which is an independent, modern state, in some ways as modern as the United States was at the same time, seeks to interpose itself to prevent this from taking place and forges an alliance with a rising Japan. Recall that Japan had ended 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation in the 1850s, under the prodding of the United States, by the way, and then went through this miraculous transition whereby by the late 1860s, it was a major power. So the Kingdom of Hawaii makes this alliance with Japan. And of course, to this very day, the plurality of the population on the Hawaiian Islands is of Japanese origin. But in any case, that's not sufficient. The Yankees overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1890s, and you know the rest of the story. By 1959, it becomes a state of the United States of America, and once again, unless you accept Donald J. Trump, that leads to the birth in 1961 of one Barack Hussein Obama. But in any case, what that story tells you is this mania for slavery. Because it's very profitable to get people to work for free, believe it or not. As a matter of fact, I was in LA airport just a few days ago, and I noticed there was a sign in the men's room saying that if you know about people who are working for free, you should report it to the California authorities. And I was saying, this is just a few days ago in Los Angeles. And so, Walmart? So I don't think we should be surprised if I see that sign in LA airport today that in the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century, and before, there is this mania for enslaving people. I mean, for example, I think I mentioned in the 1776 book that the slave trade was one of the most profitable enterprises known to humankind. I mean, you can invest $1 and make $1,700. I mean, there are people who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, trust me, to this very day. I mean, just look northward to Wall Street, for example. So this is the driving force, the driving engine of the United States. And once again, to come back to the first question that you asked, one of the reasons why Black lives don't matter is because, to a certain extent, when certain people look at us, whether they realize it or not, they see lost fortunes. Because we were able to fight our way out of that box, shedding a bit of blood, I'm afraid to say, in the process. And this is something that will never be forgiven, just like the Haitian revolutionaries. And Haiti itself will never be forgiven for helping to engineer and initiate that entire historical process.
There's another piece, recognizing that the colonies, recognizing that they're threatened, taking different approaches, seeing what's happening throughout the Caribbean. One of the responses that you make clear is the settlers, some of the settlers, want a colony.
Oh, yes.
And they want that colony to be an all-white colony.
That's right.
And a buffer in between the Spanish colony, which we know of as Florida.
Right.
Can you talk about that effort, the success or failure, however we want to look at it today?
Well, you're referring to the fact that what is now the state of Georgia was founded as a so-called all-white settlement in 1733. Now, the 2010 census showed that Georgia has more black people than any other U.S. state, so obviously that project did not work out very well. But this was part of a process of trying to escape that dilemma of slave revolts and having your labor force try to cut your throat in the middle of the night. But the problem is that, one, that the settlers in North America were expert smugglers, and so it was easy early on to smuggle in enslaved persons to work on out-of-the-way plantations. And then they were right next door to South Carolina, which for a good deal of its history had a black majority, in any case. And then setting up Georgia as this buffer between Spanish Florida. Florida, as you know, was settled by the Spanish at the beginning of the 1500s and did not enter the United States until circa 1820. So it's actually been under Spanish, it was under Spanish rule longer than under US rule. And the state was set up as a buffer because the Africans were historically trying to work with the antagonists, the enemies of the settlers. That is to say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend is a long-standing principle. And the enemy of the settlers in South Carolina, or in Georgia for that matter, were the Spanish. And the Spanish and the Africans were oftentimes collaborating, not least because many of the Africans in that part of North America were of Angolan descent. Many of them spoke Portuguese. You know that the Portuguese had colonized Angola as early as the late 1490s, early 1500s, and neighboring Congo had relations with Portuguese even before that. And so some of these Angolans were Portuguese speakers, which is similar to Spanish. Some of them were Catholic, a la the Spanish in Florida, and religious conflict was still a burning issue. And so oftentimes there was this alliance between the Angolans under the Union Jack and the Spanish. And of course, the Spanish, for various reasons, helped to create a free Negro class that dwarfed the free Negro class in what is now in the United States, or what were in the British settlements. And therefore, the Spanish would oftentimes send the free Negroes across the border to stir up things. And that, of course, leads to the so-called 7 Years' War. And this is where your grade school and high school lessons, history lessons, kick in. That is to say, 1756 to 1763, London once again expends blood and treasure to oust the Spanish from Florida and the French from Quebec, because the French in Quebec and of course Quebec still has a large French-speaking population. French and Quebec were acting similarly towards the Africans in New England and in New York. And then, of course, London wants to impose taxes on the settlers to pay for this war. And of course, the settlers, even today, they think they should get things for free without paying for it. I guess that's what slavery does to you. And that's another factor then that does lead or help to fuel the revolt against British rule.
So look, is everybody keeping up with this? So this is good. So we're starting, right? This conversation is beginning. We haven't begun, it's beginning. Okay. So, and I gotta remember to keep my mic up, y'all. So, so Gerald, so we have Georgia wanting to be an all-white colony and be this buffer. Gerald, that doesn't work so well, and you've indicated it doesn't work so well. One of the other fascinating things that you make clear is the colonists are now at odds with the mother country. They're at odds for a number of reasons. The mother country is considering freeing these Negroes. The colonists don't want their...
felt that they were going to free them.
The colonists absolutely are opposed to this, but something else you indicated that I had never considered was the arming of black folks.
Yeah.
And particularly how Spain had armed them, and then even the British is arming black folks. Can you talk about that?
Well, see, these European countries, I mean, look at Britain today. It has a population of about 65 million. In the period in which we're talking about, it might have had a population of, say, 5 to 7 or 8 million. It's trying to rule North America. It has a major colony in its jewel, that is India. India has a contemporary population of about 1.3 billion. And so London faced a real dilemma in terms of policing, and it was gravitating towards a different kind of system. Whereby a role was carved out for a free Negro class, just the way the Spanish did in Cuba, for example, which had a free Negro class as well, particularly in the military. Then, of course, London said, and then I'll just present this, I won't necessarily authenticate it. London said that, and this is taking place in the context of religious conflict, that because that so many men in Spain were gravitating towards the priesthood, that there was a deficit in terms of having enough men to police the Spanish Empire, and so therefore they had to recruit more Africans to play that particular role. And so this is placing competitive pressure on another empire, the British Empire, to do the same thing. But that runs into a stone wall of opposition from the settlers, who can think of nothing more ghastly or outrageous than putting a rifle or a musket in the hands of an African. And of course, during the war that leads to the creation of the United States of America, you have armed Africans, and that's one of the reasons why South Carolina, armed Africans under the Union Jack, under the British flag, it's one of the reasons South Carolina had such a difficulty mounting resistance against London. And then after the formation of the United States of America, when you look at London's attempt to reclaim North American territory lost to the United States in the War of 1812, in the pivotal Battle of New Orleans, December 1814, January 1815, which, by the way, I'm sure being patriotic Marylanders, you know about the Star-Spangled Banner and Francis Scott's Key and the notorious third and fourth stanzas of the newest national anthem that excoriates the Negroes in no uncertain terms. But also, of course, Washington, D.C. in August 1814 was sacked and burned by the Redcoats, with Negroes assisting them, sending James Madison, U.S. President, and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. And then, of course, many of the enslaved that are freed as a result of the burning down of Washington, D.C., are then put on British ships and moved to Trinidad and Tobago, where they actually become part of the elite of Trinidad and Tobago. Right. So the settlers, their mission, of course, was to extract profit from enslaved Africans, and that was inimical to the way that Britain was evolving, which was in part, because I don't want to overstate this, in part to have a free Negro class, particularly an armed Negro class, to help to police the empire, not least because of the numbers game. And then, of course, I haven't even talked about the fact that London did not necessarily see the Irish, which were, of course, shared the British Isles with England, did not necessarily see the Irish as reliable, did not necessarily see the Scots as reliable. As you know, there had been major conflict between the English and the Scots in the run-up to the so-called Act of Union, 1707, where they come together in the United Kingdom. But oftentimes, there was this fear that the Scots would ally with the antagonists of the English, speaking of the French, speaking of the Spanish, ditto for the Irish. And in fact, a number of the leaders of the Spanish army, in fact, were Irish. Wow. So these are some of the real dilemmas that were faced in the North Atlantic community. And I guess you might want to ask yourself, well, then why aren't these stories better known? And I think that part of it is the way that historians tell the story. Unfortunately, in my opinion, there is an aversion to what's called grand narratives, like my trying to write a history of the 17th century, and instead of focus on micro topics like the history of shoestrings in 17th century France, for example. Now, I mean, I like those micro stories because I can then take them and piece together a larger story. But in some ways, it reminds me of the first Rodney King trial. You remember in the early 1990s when the black motorist Rodney King was beaten and it was caught on tape by officers of the state. And then the officers went on trial. And then the defense lawyers, they would show a little segment of the tape, a micro segment of the tape, and say to the jury, well, do you see anything wrong there? And the juries say no. They show another micro segment and say, do you see anything wrong there? In other words, they weren't showing the entire loop. And unless you show the entire loop, it's difficult to have an organic understanding of what's going on. And so that's what's happening with history right now, is that by this aversion to larger narratives and focusing on these micro segments, many of the historians are missing the big picture. Now, of course, the upside from their point of view is that it allows them to do their work without being surveilled by the FBI or by Facebook, for that matter. And it allows them to pay their mortgages and their BMW note, et cetera. But obviously, with the election of Donald J. Trump, we reached a sort of a crossroads where those comfortable compromises are increasingly unsustainable.
Gerald, there's another dynamic, and you covered it very well in your work. A number of other writers covered in their work, but there's another dynamic that's being birthed as slavery in this hemisphere is taking its shape. There's something else that's happening. Race is being formed. Whiteness is being birthed. You talk about this. Can you riff on that for a minute?
Sure. I mean, first of all, whiteness studies. I mean, you have a number of historians right now who are focusing on what to me is a fundamental question. How is it that those who are warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, British versus French, British versus German, German versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Italian versus French, Greek versus Macedonian, all of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, magically they're all transmuted into this new identity politics that is whiteness. Now, how and why does that happen? It seems to me that's a fundamental question that we should think about. And in the 17th century book, I go into that in more detail. I mean, I see this identity politics, to use that current phrase, as a response to colonialism. That is to say that these European countries are relatively small, particularly the Dutch. As a matter of fact, if we had been talking in 1650, and we were projecting into 2018, we probably think that we'd be sitting here speaking Dutch instead of English, for example. But it's even smaller than England. And so in order to rule these vast territories, you need a new kind of identity. And also I should say that the emerging system of capitalism tends to privilege this kind of borderless identity. Because the settlers in neighboring Virginia, for example, they wanted to trade with the Dutch and not just be limited into this imperial relationship with London. And that too contributes to this new politics of identity. And so this leads to the creation of whiteness. Now, and talking to many people, sometimes people tend to see whiteness the way they look at, I guess, Homo sapien. They tend to see it as some sort of a natural category that's been around for, I don't know, I guess thousands of years. But if you begin to examine the evidence, you can say that it's a phenomenon of the 17th century, or you can examine the evidence and perhaps say it's a phenomenon of the early 16th century. Although I have to say that when I wrote the 1776 book, I put the origins in the 1660s. When I wrote the 1776 book, I put the origins in the 1660s. And when I wrote the 17th century book, I put the origins in the 1500s. I'm now trying to do a book on the 1500s, so I may be going back a little further, which is obviously complicating the story in my mind. And because I have to say that up until I started this book on the 1500s, I was persuaded by the idea that whiteness, anti-black racism, are emerging organically out of colonialism, slavery, and the slave trade. And I will not argue with anyone who takes that position. But the further back I go, I'm getting a bit unsettled and unsure. And I haven't done the research yet, so don't press me on that. So just suffice it to say, let the record show I'm becoming more unsettled and unsure.
Certainly, though, at a certain point, you're going to go. At a certain point, you're going to hit a period, I think, in which whiteness does not exist. I mean, I understand what you're saying. This is inquiry, y'all. So I'm talking to the professor because I don't know.
And I may not know either, because I said I'm becoming more unsettled.
So at a certain point, because the term whiteness at a certain point certainly might exist, but it will not have the meaning that it has now. I think about Malcolm coming back from Mecca saying, yeah, when they say white here, it means boss. When they say white over there, it just does not mean the same thing. And so I'm going to be curious as you study, as you write, and as you share with us your findings. I'm going to be curious about that.
Well, let me also say, I think that people in the United States should look around, I mean, literally, and ask themselves this question: why is it that you have a so-called one-drop rule in the United States of America? I mean, why is it that anyone in this room presumably could be black? All you have to do is say, I'm black, and nobody really questions you, because they say, why would you adopt that identity voluntarily? But that's not necessarily the case all over the world. I mean, it's not necessarily the case in Brazil. It's not necessarily the case in South Africa. And then you should begin to ask yourself the question, well, why is that the case here in North America? And that might lead you down the road of interrogating slavery and interrogating the fact that there was an attempt to broaden the base for enslaving people. I mean, there are cases, for example, of European migrants landing in New Orleans in the 1850s, and some unscrupulous slave trader grabs them and says, oh, you're black. Say, no, I'm not black. I just came here from Europe. Well, prove that you're not black. Well, I mean, it broadens the base for enslavement. It adopts this principle that any kind of African ancestry is a stain, which obviously helps to fuel white supremacy. It helps to fuel anti-black racism. And of course, it's still with us today, because to a greater or lesser degree, we still observe the one-drop rule. Although I'm beginning to think that that may not hold, assuming that Donald Trump does not blow up the world. That is to say, I'm not sure if that'll hold for the entire course of the 21st century. And perhaps some of you might even want to, or Paul, you might even want to respond to that, to say if whether the United States might evolve to a Brazilian type system, a South African type system, et cetera.
Yeah. If you will forgive me, Professor, I will hold my speculations because I really want to. I really want to explore. I really want to explore the benefit of your research. So we're going to leave this for 1 minute, right? Just 1 minute. But I want to come back because there's a question I have to get that will carry us back to talk about Africans and the struggle. But when I'm thinking about your research and exploring the benefit of your research. So when I first heard of Gerald Horne, someone said something like, "Do you know Gerald Horne?" I said, "Well, I know I've heard the name, but I don't know him." And I remember that person saying, "He's a beast." And what they were talking about was his research capabilities. And over time, I was watching videos on YouTube, and there were a number of people comment on your focus at research. People refer to Gerald Horne as almost like a automaton or something that goes into research institutions and do not come out. He does not come out until he's got a book in hand or 2 books in hand or 3 books in hand. Can you talk to us a little bit about, I don't understand how you do it. I've worked in archives, I've been in archives, but how do you spend the time you spend, and how do you get the productivity out of that time that you do, Gerald?
Well, I mean, first of all,
excuse me 1 minute. I told y'all I published a book. The other book on the end of settler colonialism is out. That's 2 books in 2018. There's at least a 3rd and possibly a 4th book coming out this year. This man has been producing 2 to 3 books a year for the last decade. Is that right? I mean, is that close on average? So that's the basis of this question, okay?
I mean, first of all, you need a thesis. Like that 17th century book, it's a very simple thesis. I've already stated it. Early 1600s, England is a minor power. Late 1600s, England is a major power. The reason is slavery. So, you know, that's my thesis. Then that was my animating principle. I'm trying to do a precursor study to the 1776 book, looking at how slavery drove 1776, and then how slavery drove 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution. But sometimes, of course, like this book on the 1500s, matter of fact, maybe somebody can give me a thesis. I have a jumble of ideas, but I don't really have a thesis. Certainly not something I can't reduce to 3 or 4 sentences. I mean, I know that London is a parasite feeding on the host body that is the Spanish Empire through piracy, Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, etc. And then, of course, you make that leap to see the glorification of the descendants of pirates, which are, of course, gangsters and the gangster culture, to the point where gangster is not only a noun, it's a verb in this country. So, you know, so I have that. I have, you know, the Ottoman Empire, of course, which 1517, it takes over Egypt. The rise of Protestantism, 1517, you mark the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther just this past fall. You know, the founding of St. Augustine, Florida, by the Spanish, and of course, enslaved Africa. Even though I'm going to be giving, like other people, these talks in 2019 about the 400th year of the arrival of Africans in North America. I mean, that's a notional date. I mean, actually, you had enslaved Africans before then. And of course, the founding of Florida by the Spanish circa 15. But I don't really have I have a jumble of ideas, but a jumble of ideas does not a book make. And so perhaps some of you can feed me a thesis that I can then hang these jumble of ideas on. Now, when I was doing that book I just mentioned, The South Seas, I started that book by trying to look at the Yankee enslavers who go to the South Seas. But I found that it wasn't enough to do an entire book about that. So then I had to pivot to somehow bring Hawaii into the story. And fortunately, Hawaii was trying to stop this new slave trade, and so that gives me the nexus. And then I can then pivot to talking about the attempt by Hawaii to rebuff Yankee colonialism. Now, this book on the 1500s, I'm going to go to Turkey to do research, because the Ottoman Turks are a major player. I mean, there's this whole question of Islam, and of course, obviously, I cannot be indifferent to the question of Islamophobia in 2018, and try to look at some of the roots of that. So I'm going to go, but as you know, they had a change in alphabet in Turkey after Ataturk, post World War I. And so all the documents from the 1500s are in Ottoman Arabic, which I don't read Ottoman Arabic. And so I'm going to have to hire an assistant. And then hopefully the assistant is competent and can follow my guidance with regard to going over these documents in Ottoman Arabic as I try to extract. And I'm going to be asking the assistant to look at documents on the relationship between the Ottomans and Ethiopia, for example, which is able to maintain a certain kind of freedom, not least because of diplomatic assistance from the Ottoman Turks. And so this research process, I mean, I think it works best if you have some sort of animating thesis, if you have a narrative line that you can follow, because that tells you what to take notes on. Like where I am now with this 1500s project, it's sort of, I'm all over the place, because I'm not sure what my narrative line is. I'm not sure what the thesis is. I mean, I'm like the proverbial 7-year-old in a soccer game, where you tell them to be a fullback, just stand near the goalie, okay? But then once the ball heads down the field, they head down the field, So whenever I see something that looks interesting, I'm off. And that's not a way to do history, to be distracted, because you don't have a thesis, you don't have a narrative line. You're just sort of driven by whatever seems interesting. But hopefully, what will happen is if I keep digging, I'll come up with a narrative line. Maybe some bright, brilliant person in the audience will say, Professor Horne, this is your thesis about the 1500s that you should be writing about. And I'll say, that sounds interesting, and I'll make a mental note and then follow up. Or perhaps I'll never come up with a narrative line, and I'll produce a book that's just a jumble of disconnected ideas.
Well, you haven't done that yet. You haven't done it yet, so we'll look for that. Look, so we're going to get ready and take questions and answers. Answers are coming from Dr. Horne. There's one mic here. You have to line up at the mic if you have questions. And hopefully we've touched on enough areas to generate some questions. I do have, so people can line up, I do have 2 questions that came from people across Facebook. One, when you talk about the turmoil, particularly of that's going on to birth 1776, there's a question of how are women, black women particularly, engaged in this? What are they doing? How are they changing the world? How is the world changing them? That's one. Following that, can you talk about Paul Robeson?
Oh, yeah, good.
Because Robeson comes through your work, and there's similarities. You're Princeton, he's Princeton. You're a lawyer, he was a lawyer. He was a gifted man, and you celebrate him so often in your work. So that's 2, and I apologize for those 2, Cameron.
Well, there's a chapter in that 1776 book about, I think it's post-1750 slave resistance in North America. And therein, you see particularly the role of women, particularly women who are working in the household, who are to use a sophisticated term, ethnobotanists. In other words, they know the qualities of certain plants that are poisonous, and so they're using these plants to seek vengeance against the slave masters by poisoning them, or they're poisoning the food. They're arsonists. They're burning down the fields. They're burning down the houses, etc. And I'm sure that you know that there's so much fury and anger in these women in particular, because it's not an exaggeration to suggest that there are fewer groups of women that have been subjected to sexual abuse on the level of enslaved African women in North America. And of course, there's been writing, and I said North America, I should have said the Caribbean also, because oftentimes when people look for evidence, they go to Jamaica, and there's these books about this slave owner, Thomas Thistlewood, European slave owner, who keeps detailed records about all the African women he's abusing for whatever reason. And so, we have a lot of evidence in that regard, and of course there's been a lot of work too by historians of the enslavement of women. Now, with regard to Paul Robeson, I think that he is an archetype in the sense that he's the tallest tree in our forest. He's a man who is a leading scholar, but for the prodding and pushing of his spouse, Islanda Good Robeson, he might have been a professor of philology. He studied languages as a hobby. He spoke most of the European languages, studied African languages. There's a story I tell in my biography of Robeson that before he was to give a concert in Norway, he started studying Norwegian for about 48 to 72 hours so he could go try to talk to the people. And obviously when you speak to people in their own language, it's very moving, it's very affecting. And I think that's one of the reasons why Robeson was such a global hero, is because he spoke to the people literally and figuratively in their own languages. And people are respectful, and they're very pleased if they think that you've taken the time to study their language so that you can better communicate with them. But of course, Robeson fell victim to Cold War pressures. Our friends in the NAACP, for example, made this bargain whereby if they turned their back on Robeson, there would be these civil rights concessions. The problem was that when you defeated, in a sense, this leading internationalist, you defeated one of our major tools of revolt and resistance going back centuries, which is internationalism, which has left us with this domestic arena where, in domestic arena, no matter how you parse the numbers, no matter how you torture the numbers to make them confess, Donald J. Trump still wound up being president. And that does not speak very well, I'm afraid to say, for the United States of America. And this is the dilemma in which we are now facing, and I would argue that the sidelining and marginalizing of a figure like Robeson has a lot to do with the present dilemma that we are now confronted with.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you, Dave.
So I had a question for you about, we all know about the Koch brothers. You know, they are billionaires that made their money on fossil fuel extraction, and now they have spent the last several decades spending millions and millions of dollars with other fellow elite to sort of undermine regulations and laws throughout the country. But there's this recent scholarship done linking the ideological underpinning of their work to James Buchanan, who was an economist who gained prominence in the 50s in Virginia when they were thinking of a legal way to oppose Brown in Virginia, and they actually traced, the original scholarship that he used to James Calhoun in the 1820s. So I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on and insight on one of the biggest problems the whole globe is facing today, and how that relates back to slavery and the brutality of the founding of this country.
Well, first of all, thank you for that question. And as I'm sure you know, the man who may become the next U.S. Secretary of State, just met with Kim in North Korea, we were just told. Mike Pompeo, of course, hails from Wichita and could fairly be called the Koch brothers man in Washington, although it's fair to say that there have been tensions and contradictions, at least in 2016, between the Koch brothers and one Donald J. Trump, which is part of this whole phenomenon of a certain kind of elite dissatisfaction with Donald J. Trump. Now, you're referring to the work of the Duke University historian Nancy McLean, who tries to draw a parallel between these attacks on the public sector and the Koch brothers' attack on the public sector and government regulations. What's interesting is that when the United States was forced to move away from Jim Crow schools and school segregation, the Dixiecrats in places like Virginia, you may know, since you're close to Virginia, they shut down the public schools in certain counties in Virginia, which deprived young black youth of 3, 4, 5 years of education, and then set up these so-called segregation academies, whereby there was this sort of united front amongst those defined as white, where they were able to provide subsidies for white kids to go to these segregation academies. And you should not see this as being apart from the not only the attack on the public sector that has driven school teachers into the streets in West Virginia and Oklahoma, amongst other states, but also you should see this as an attempt to undermine the public sector more generally, which is what this tax cut bill of December 2017 was all about, so that now the Republicans in Congress can say, well, we have to cut programs because there's no money. That is to say, as one conservative once put it, to reduce the size of government to the point where you can strangle it in a bathtub, for example. And you could go further to make an argument that there's a lot of anger, just like there's a lot of anger towards black people, because in some ways we represent lost fortunes. There's a sort of anger at the US government, because after all, it was the US government that mandated that these fortunes should be taken without compensation. And a lot of the fury it's no accident that the Republicans are strongest in Dixie, strongest in the South, and a lot of this anger at the public sector and at the government, it seems to me, can be traced back at least till 1865, when the whole system of slavery was turned on its head and property was taken without compensation by the US government. And of course, the Dixiecrats would say it was taken without due process of law, which they would say is a violation of the US Constitution. That's what they would say.
And thank you. And, okay. I'm going to ask you to hold. Our time is running, so I'm going to have to take the next question behind you. How much time do we have left? 20 minutes. Oh, okay, good.
Yes. Thank you for your work, Dr. Horne. I read Race to Revolution and Counter-Revolution in 1776 simultaneously at the behest of a friend of mine at Red Emma's. And I was locked in 100%. Thank you for coming to Red Emma's a short time back. My question is very, very visceral. And it pertains to what do you see as the tipping point of, let's use as an illustration, the cover of Counter-Revolution. Or, you know, the cover, and you know, it's got a bunch of black people killing a bunch of white people, okay? And I find myself with each indignity being pushed. I am a very peaceful person.
I hear you.
But I'm only peaceful with people who are peaceful with me. Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the things that really hit me hard, took me back to the Vietnam era, was this young man that immolated himself in Central Park a few days ago. Yeah. I would venture to say there are probably people in this audience that have thought about doing that. Wow. I just feel that we are at a tipping point. We are at the precipice of extreme ugliness, not just here, but throughout the planet. And I just wanted to get from you, do you think it's a number? Is it going to be a series of acts? I'll leave it in your hands to answer that question.
Well, thank you. That's a very difficult question to answer, since I'm more accustomed to looking at the past more so than making a projection for the future. So let me struggle to try to respond and introduce a point that I've only mentioned in passing, but I think all of us need to think about more deeply. And that is that the tension between Washington and Moscow is escalating. The United States is talked about starting a trade war with China. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, has suggested that he would like to see the Iranian regime overthrown before the end of 2019. And another interesting note, Japan and China had one of its highest level meetings in about a decade, just this past week, not least because Tokyo is upset because when Trump lifted tariffs against many steel tariffs that have been imposed on many of the so-called U.S. allies, he didn't lift them on Japan. And of course, a staple of Trump discourse, to the extent that you can pinpoint a discourse, has been anti-Tokyo bashing going back to the 1980s. And any sort of entente that's ongoing between Tokyo and Beijing could be as earth-shaking as the entente between Beijing and Washington in the early 1970s. I say all that to say that I think that in terms of trying to do an analysis of where this country is going, that we not only need to look at the domestic forces, not only because when you look at the domestic forces, sometimes you can become very pessimistic, but also because it's necessary to look at the international arena. And I would say particularly for black people, because that's been our saving grace, that's been our salvation historically, is the ability to organize on the global scale and organize forces internationally to put pressure on the United States. For example, the way Robeson did in 1950 when he helped to organize the We Charge Genocide petition, going to the United Nations and putting U.S. Jim Crow in the spotlight, which then is a material factor in forcing the United States to make an agonizing retreat from Jim Crow. I think in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education and all the litigation that comes thereafter. So I think that's really the missing link with regard to our struggle. You're here in Baltimore. You should go out, what was it, Mount Hope Boulevard, and knock on their door and talk to the folks out there about reviving their international apparatus. I think that that's the missing link in our struggle. And certainly we need it, because we don't need strong brothers like you, my man, talking about self-immolation.
Yeah. Thank you, Gerald. Yes, sir.
My name is Chris. So I have you're good. I can lean. Okay, cool. So I just had two really quick questions. My first question is, I have a drop in the large ocean of knowledge that you have, very, very small drop. My first question is actually rather simple. How does one start the path of, I guess, enlightenment, so to say, about learning these issues? How does, not issues, I guess, but how do you, where does one begin? I know this is a strange question. Is it a matter of getting a degree? Where do you start the educational process? If so, for example, if it's just reading certain books and understanding certain scholars, how does one discern who can be trusted and who's fake news? Does that make sense?
Okay, so Chris, can you ask the other one?
Yeah, the other one's really quick as well. So you said economically that colonization was an economic statement, and well, at least I don't know if you necessarily made that point, but that it was, when people see certain property now walking around free, that there's some offense to that. I was wondering, for the second question, how does that play out today? What does it look like to say that we are still economic? I mean, is this as African Americans still economic property, and how does that? I could see obviously that you lost a truck ton of money back in the 1800s because your slaves are not walking free. But how does that, I guess, compare to today?
Well, I mean, I think that's a factor. I think part of it's that previous factor that I mentioned, which is the so-called stain of slavery, the so-called stain of not being part of the human family. Just as if you eat a turkey sandwich or a roast beef sandwich, you don't have necessarily pangs of conscience because see that as a normalized behavior. And so likewise, if you're abusing black people under slavery, that becomes a normalized behavior, particularly when it's not interrogated, when you go from slavery to non-slavery without any sort of no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, or any sort of vehicle of that sort. Now, with regard to knowledge, I can't recall if on that video this was mentioned, but I can only speak about myself. Well, I'd strike that from the record. I guess I can speak about other people, but I will speak about myself. You know, I was a child laborer. I sold newspapers from the age of 6 or 7 years old because I was from this poor working class family in St. Louis. And because I was selling newspapers, I began to read newspapers at a very early age. And still, I still am a firm believer in reading newspapers. So in terms of self-knowledge, I mean, like, for example, I read New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Houston Chronicle, LA Times, Financial Times of London, China Daily. And then on the internet, those are all hard copies. And then on the internet, of course, you know, Guardian of London, Mail and Guardian of South Africa, allafrica.com, aatimes.com, asiatimes.com. And then, of course, The Economist of London, which it styles itself as a British publication, but it's really, you could call it a right-wing Yankee publication. But it's interesting nonetheless. You know, Business Week, The New Yorker, People Magazine, because I want to know what my students know. And that's what they read. And I mean, I could go on in this, you know, historical journals. So, but of course, that's just individualized. And of course, at least when I was growing up, there used to be this thing about study groups. I don't know if people still have study groups, where, you know, you pick some book and then you read it. You know, it could be a novel or history or something, and then you come together and share ideas about it. I found I'm not in any study groups now, but during its flourishing, I enjoyed study groups. I mean, I thought that they were very interesting to share ideas with different people about different novels and short stories, et cetera. And then, of course, the study group is sort of an arm of a political organization that turbocharges it, that supercharges it. And so that's really what I would recommend, finally.
Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Much respect to both brothers. My question...
Your name, sir?
Owusu Bandele.
Got you.
First, quick question. First is, could you say a little bit more in terms of the position of people of African descent in the War of 1812 as opposed to American Revolution in terms of their numbers? Were there any major battles where they actually large numbers on each side fighting against each other, and the lot of each, you know, group after the war? And the second question is in terms of the importance of context. What are some of the pitfalls that someone like Glenn Beck, bringing out a lot of participation in terms of African Americans, but still building into the so-called American dream?
Glenn, you mean the former Fox News commentator?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he had a show my brother shared just recently in terms of participation of people of African descent in the American Revolution.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's well established, and I've written it too, that by several orders of magnitude, the Africans, the Negroes, fought with London against the settlers because they thought that that was in their best interest, because London was on a faster track towards abolition. And likewise, with regard to the War of 1812, not only do you have more Africans fighting under the Union Jack, and in the pivotal Battle of New Orleans, which I made mention to a few moments ago, and this is represented in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, which came out a few years ago, that I would say about 15 to 20% of the folks fighting under the Union Jack were black. And of course, you cannot say that about the white supremacists in the United States of America. So there has been a lot of work in that regard. I just don't think, I think that many of the historians, from their point of view, they feel that they're being sympathetic to black people if they point out, if they don't stress the fact that black people were fighting against the United States, because they say, you know, black people have enough problems without stressing and emphasizing how they were fighting against the United States. And, you know, I sort of understand that. But on the other hand, you know, these U.S. people, you know, they always go to these other countries and say, I remember during, you know, during the wars in the Balkans, after Tito passes away in the 90s, you know, these Yankee commentators are always saying, no, you need to face your history, no matter how painful it might be, you know. Now, of course, you know, physician, heal thyself. I mean, you know, why don't you face your own history? But of course, they always find a reason not to face their own history, although they're always telling people to face their history. And, you know, it's the typical hypocrisy. Now, I'm not sure if I'm able to comment on Glenn Beck, perhaps.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you.
First, I'd like to also extend my greetings and my respect for both of you gentlemen. I'm also an elder born in 1939.
Oh, my goodness.
And also an author. And as an author, I don't want to get into my book because I didn't come here for that. I came here because I was stimulated by something you said in terms of what you'd like to dig into. And so my question, I'd like to make one quick statement about the compensation to the slaveholders for this property. Nobody talks about the compensation to the slaves for their period of servitude.
Hear, hear.
And so it's very, very important.
Hear, hear.
And my question would be, do you think that we have put enough emphasis on our history prior to 1619, 1620, especially the civilization that we gave to the world when we were in Europe? And how could we begin to merge that history with the youngsters so that they don't have to start off with a sense of inferiority by starting off saying, well, I'm a slave and I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps and I don't have boots. You know, in other words, if we could bring some of the contributions of greatness beyond that period, maybe it could go back to the 7th century and move itself up and merge that with all the great scholars that have done the history since we've been here. Bring those two pieces together to give some sense of I don't want to use the word greatness, but, you know, self-pride and dignity without starting from the period of slavery.
Well, thank you. And as a person who was wandering through Black Classic Press just a few hours ago, if you want to find those sorts of texts, you can find them right here in Baltimore. Because I noticed in terms of the BCP catalog, there are a number of books in the vein that you were just...
I'm familiar. I'm just trying to figure out how we can collaborate, if I may, to try to enhance it, because I'm very familiar with Paul. In fact, I approached him when I went in to do what I was going to do. But I want to know what kind of way we can, can we contribute, any of us contribute anything to stimulate your digging into.
Oh, I see. Well, as once was said, I've experienced more yesterdays than I'll experience tomorrows, I'm afraid. And, I'm back to the 1500s now. I'm already beginning to think about the 1400s, but I'm not sure how much longer I'll be around. So somebody else is going to have to pick up the baton. But I will say this on a practical level, and once again, this is not original to me, is that it would be quite useful to have Saturday schools, whereby, now of course, I'm sure that's subject to the complaint that, well, you're overworking these kids. I mean, shouldn't you also be pressuring the K through 12 schools to play this role? I would say yes. But I think it also, as a stopgap measure, to have Saturday schools where this kind of knowledge can be imparted. And I would also say, too, where we could introduce our young people to the study of foreign languages at an early age. Because one of the things I find interesting, like studying slavery in Florida, for example, one of the reasons why the black people became so pivotal in Florida was because oftentimes they were the interlocutors. I mean, they spoke English, of course, and they spoke Native American languages. They spoke Spanish. And thinking about that, I'm not sure if we've maintained that tradition of being the interlocutors by being multilingual. And that's another issue that we could address in Saturday schools. But certainly, I applaud the point that you just made.
Okay, so this, okay,
Tracy.
so the young lady,
Oh, go ahead.
the young lady's going to be the last question for the evening, okay? We've got about 5 minutes, and we've got a cocktail reception, book signing. Oh gosh, all that good stuff is going to happen after we finish this up, you know? Yes, sir.
Yes, well, welcome to Baltimore, Gerald. My name's Doug Colbert, and a long time ago, when Gerald was a much younger person, I had the pleasure of teaching with Gerald in 1981 at City College, and that was before he wrote most of his 36 novels or books. I don't know if he had written any at that point, but you certainly were a big influence on many of us and the students that we taught. And that leads to the question that I want to ask, which I think you've been answering in many different ways tonight. I'm still teaching. I teach at Maryland Law School. And I guess my question is the importance of education and the fact that so many of, not just our students, but so many people lack the history of our own country, much less the international history of the human rights movement, of the post-1945 doctrines that you hold so much faith and I do as well. So I really want your comments on whether education is where it really begins, that if more people understood the ugly history of this country and really understood how much violence has been done for 400 years, whether that would awaken the conscience of this country, whether that would tell our legislators and everyone who's in power that reparations is a must and that we must really rebuild to give people the future that the human rights movement has declared in so many different ways.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, as an educator, as a person who makes a living as an educator and who writes books, hopefully with the idea that somebody might read them at some point, I would be the last person to denigrate the necessity for education. But as you probably know, W.B. Du Bois, when he was first starting out, he had this idea that if he could just get the facts out, that that would be enough to sway consciousness and sway minds. And then he came to the conclusion that, well, maybe not. And so I think, and I'm sure you would agree, we need not only education, but we need organization. We need the organizing of more unions at the workplace, unions to resist gentrification and push for rent control, student unions to push for tuition freezes and tuition rollbacks. One of the deficits, one of the many deficits we have in this country is not enough organization. And so I think that I mentioned a moment ago the idea of these study groups linked to organizing is a turbocharged phenomenon, and I would reiterate that point here.
And we had in New York, if you remember, the Marxist School, and people like yourself and Cornel West and many others came and taught classes there, and that was a big boost for many people. I just wonder if the Real News or a place like this could open itself up evenings or something like that so that there can be classes taught or people coming in and speaking truth to us.
Well, speaking of the Real News, I want to encourage everyone to support the Real News Network. To make where there are study groups every day on the air and to make conversations like these possible. And I hope that you don't leave this space without signing up and becoming a member and donating at the Real News table, which is right outside to your right. Thank you very much.
And Doug, I was waving at you to say that someone from the Real News will come up and address that as we close out.
Dr. Horne and Dr. Coates, thank you for this humbling opportunity. I am very young, and as the gentleman said before, I only have a drop of knowledge compared to your large river of information that you have gained for yourself. So thank you for this, number one. My name is Jessica Goodman, and I come from a business perspective. How can young African Americans get the attention to themselves to just take back what we deserve and kind of incorporate that into the American society without threatening Americans in order to be ourselves? And that's the only question that I have. Thank you.
Well, obviously that's a very difficult and complicated question that you pose, but I'm thinking of the Starbucks episode in Philadelphia where, for business reasons, perhaps for humanitarian reasons, let us hope the latter, that Starbucks is going to be closing its stores, I think 8,000 of them on a day in May, and then engaging in a certain kind of education with regard to not seeing a person like yourself as a threat to be turned away, which is something that happens, as we know, on a daily, if not hourly or minute-by-minute basis in the United States for reasons we've already made reference to. And once again, I leave you, and I think it's an appropriate point to conclude with the 2 points, education and organization. And I'll leave you with that point, and thank you to Paul Coates, thank you to you for your attention, and thank you to the Real News.
Look, I want to ask one question in closing. Was this as good for you as it was for me?
Oh, my goodness.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
They were amazing, weren't they? Now, I know a lot of you still seem to have some questions or things that you might want to say. As you know, we have a cocktail reception just right here at the end of the block at our restaurant, Ida B's Table. If you have not been there yet, you need to take yourself there this evening. When I tell you about modern soul food, it's delicious. So please, you will be able to find Dr. Gerald Horne there as well. He's going to be signing some of his books there with us this evening. You're going to be able to talk to Paul Coates up close and personal, and a lot of our staff as well. And for those of you who haven't been to Ida B's Table, the reason why we even call it Ida B's to begin with is that it's named after Ida B. Wells, who is the legendary journalist, one of the founding members of the NAACP. I see a lot of heads shaking because, yeah, we know what's up, right? Everybody in here knows what's up. So thank you so much for coming this evening. And like I said, you want to just head right down the street, and we'll have a book signing. Can I make a quick announcement? You can do whatever you like.
Look, I apologize. I apologize. I told you I was here to do the Gerald thing tonight, and that's what I did. But I also, I was supposed to invite everybody to the 40th anniversary celebration of Black Classic Press, which will be May the 18th and May the 19th. You can, there's some cards around with information. You can also just go to our website, blackclassicbooks.com, and get all the information you need. And I hope you guys will be able to come out. Okay? Thank you. I forgot. I can't believe
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, sir. How's it going, man? Good to see you.